You're about to hear the story no one's telling. A silent collapse so deep it starts in the soil and ends in your wallet. This is the story of how a quiet economic disaster swept through the heartland. Not caused by drought, not by disease, but by decisions made in Washington boardrooms and overseas negotiation tables, far from the people they affected most. This isn't just about trade. It's about betrayal wrapped in bureaucracy and a storm that's been building in silence. Politicians called it strategy. Farmers called it survival, and now it's a full-blown economic disaster hiding in plain sight. Why did China walk away? Why are allies now turning their backs? And how did America go from feeding the planet to being shut out of its own table? Stick around, because by the time this video ends, you'll realize the collapse isn't coming. It's already here. Tariff fuses lit. When politicians in Washington began talking tariffs, most farmers didn't panic. They had heard it before. Some even welcomed the talk, hoping it might help curb unfair competition. Then came the details: tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on goods from Canada and Mexico. The targets sounded unrelated to agriculture, but the impact was immediate and everywhere. Canadian feed grain, essential for dairy operations across the northern states, suddenly cost more, much more. Fertilizer, largely dependent on imported components, spiked in price. Machinery orders were delayed, then canceled. The tariff web wasn't just catching foreign exporters, it was tightening around American farmers themselves. Carlos Martinez, who runs a dairy in upstate New York, opened his latest invoice and found a new line scribbled in red ink, an increase of $2,200, directly linked to feed tariffs passed on from his supplier. "We can't just swap vendors," he said. "Our blend is specific to our cows, and I can't raise prices on milk. I'm stuck." He wasn't alone. Across the country, farmers reported jumps in fertilizer costs by 30% in some regions. Seed prices climbed by 20%. Equipment dealers tacked on tariff adjustment fees. A single tractor part that once took a week now took 6. Time, cost, and uncertainty, all rising. Meanwhile, the prices for what they produced were sliding in the opposite direction. It wasn't one policy or one decision. It was a chain reaction, and each new duty from Washington acted like a spark. The barn doors were open. The weather was right, but the economics of farming were about to turn upside down. Export casualties cataloged. The collapse of sorghum was just the first domino. What came next was worse. Soybean exports to China, once valued at over $10 billion, dropped by more than 80% within months. Corn, pork, cotton, and poultry followed. Buyers stepped back. Brokers walked away. Containers that once sailed out of American ports now sat idle. Ava Reynolds, a commodity trader based in Des Moines, watched the futures markets crash in real time. It wasn't just red lines on a screen. It was contracts evaporating. Margin calls came in quick succession. Farmers who had signed forward contracts were suddenly stuck with product no one could afford to move. Soybeans plummeted. Pork was under embargo. Corn shipments were redirected and then returned. Wheat became a story of oversupply and nowhere to send it. Even dairy, long thought stable, began to struggle as futures grew soft and global. Buyers looked elsewhere. It wasn't a matter of poor strategy. It wasn't bad luck. It was the unraveling of decades of market building. Futures were no longer speculative. They were negative. By the end of the quarter, many of the country's top agricultural exports had been reduced by half or more. What had taken generations to construct was being dismantled by policy shifts that came too fast, too hard, and without any warning. Now look, you've just seen the receipts: contracts canceled, futures crushed, livelihoods erased. If that kind of truth matters, subscribe and share, because the more people who hear this, the harder it gets to ignore. There was still hope that traditional allies would help fill the void. After all, trade wasn't only with China. Europe, Canada, and others had long-standing ties with America's Farm Belt. But those ties were already fraying when allies go ice cold. If American farmers were hoping their allies would step in, the news from Brussels struck like a cold wind across the heartland. The European Union, responding to earlier U.S. tariffs on metals, implemented its own series of retaliatory duties. 25% on a targeted list of American agricultural goods. This wasn't an accident. It was precision retaliation, meant to sting in the most politically vulnerable places. Almonds from California, peanuts from Georgia, processed pork from the Midwest, all hit. For some, the European Union represented their second largest buyer. For others, it was their only overseas customer. Rosa Hernandez, who grows almonds on 200 acres outside Fresno, watched as shipment orders disappeared. We had buyers in Spain and France. That dried up overnight. She had already harvested her crop when the tariffs went into effect. Now, much of it sits in cold storage, slowly losing value, with no destination in sight. The retaliation wasn't just symbolic, it was effective. German processors moved to Turkish hazelnuts. France increased Brazilian imports. Spanish retailers rewrote contracts with South American suppliers. In boardrooms and government offices across the European Union, long-term shifts were locked in, with urgency. They weren't waiting for Washington to resolve the situation. For American exporters, those shifts meant more than a bad year. They meant a lost future. Because once a trade route is severed, it rarely returns. And when competitors take your place on foreign shelves, they don't give it back. A trade war that had begun with headlines about steel and national security was now gutting the farm economy, one buyer at a time. What came next was not only economic, it was personal, because beyond the contracts and tariffs, real people were beginning to disappear from the land. The silence was no longer just in the silos. It was in the homes, the schools, and the town halls of rural America. Faces behind the figures. Behind every charted decline, every percentage drop, every red arrow on a broker's screen is a family that believed in the ground beneath their feet. A family that planted, harvested, and hoped, only to watch the world shift away from them. James Walker farms corn in western Iowa. He has done so since his teenage years, working alongside his father and grandfather. This season, like many others, he is planting, not because the market tells him it makes sense, but because the land tells him it is time. We're putting seed in the ground knowing we might lose money on every acre, he says. That's the reality now. It's not business anymore, it's stubbornness. His sentiment echoes across the plains. From Kentucky to Illinois, farmers are speaking in hushed tones about whether they should even bother harvesting crops that may not be worth the diesel it takes to cut them. The emotional toll is not just financial, it's existential. What does a grower become when there is nothing left to grow for? The silence that follows a failed sale is not like any other. It creeps into early mornings and long nights. Equipment stays parked. Feed orders shrink. Days feel longer, heavier. And the worst part? No one in Washington seems to hear it. Still, some cling to optimism. They point to relief packages, to stimulus announcements, to talk of recovery. But inside the farmhouses, optimism has a price. And that price is getting harder to pay, caught in the vice. As commodity prices slide, the cost of doing business is climbing relentlessly. Fertilizer is no longer a guaranteed input, it's a gamble. Seed costs have gone up by 20%, with fewer financing options than before. Farm machinery, already expensive, now comes with added surcharges due to component tariffs. Even repairs are delayed. One missing gear, stuck in a port somewhere, can sideline a vital piece of equipment for weeks. In Illinois, a dealership manager named Paul recounts how 5 farmers canceled their orders within a single week. They're not upgrading, not leasing, not even renting, he says. They're holding on with what they've got, which for many is running on hope and baling wire. Crop insurance premiums are spiking in response to market volatility. Feed prices are erratic. Fuel costs rise, even as revenue falls. In short, farmers are being pressed from both sides. Their operating costs are up, their income is down, and no one is sure when or if that pattern will reverse. The pressure is more than financial, it's psychological. Every phone call from a supplier brings tension. Every envelope in the mailbox might be a lender, a lien holder, or a letter that pushes a farm closer to the edge. The vice tightens daily without pause. Some say relief is on the way. That help is coming. But most farmers know the truth. Help is not the same as healing. Checks versus customers. The government's answer so far has been money, billions in aid, one-time checks, promises of back pay, insurance rebates, bridge loans. It sounds good at a podium. It looks bold in a press release. But to most farmers, it feels hollow. Relief doesn't fix relationships, says Sarah Owens, a soybean farmer outside Springfield. China didn't stop buying because we weren't good. They stopped because of the war we didn't start. A check doesn't open that market again. The $15 billion in emergency relief have helped keep some operations afloat, but for many they arrive too late, or with strings that make them impossible to use. Paperwork delays, unclear eligibility, payments that cover a fraction of the actual loss, and perhaps worst of all, a sense of being pitied, not partnered with. What farmers want is not charity. They want contracts. They want trade flows reopened, long-term agreements signed, foreign buyers back at the table. They want the structure of agriculture restored, not a lifeline tossed from a political stage. In the absence of real engagement, many are being forced to play short-term games, sell at a loss to cut storage fees, delay equipment maintenance, take personal loans, sacrifice next season for a sliver of this one. The frustration is no longer whispered. It's reaching the ears of representatives, senators, governors, because the people who once cheered those leaders into office are now demanding answers. Town hall turmoil. The anger that once simmered in private is now boiling over in public. In small towns across the Midwest and South, county halls are filling, not with celebration, but with confrontation. At one recent event in Kentucky, a large hand-painted banner hung over the stage. "We voted for you. Now you listen." The message was clear. The loyalty that defined rural political identity is not unconditional. It must be earned again and again. Elsie McKinney, a peanut grower from the outskirts of Bowling Green, stood at the microphone with her voice trembling but firm. "We didn't ask for bailouts. We asked for trade. We asked for a plan. You gave us press conferences and chaos." Her words were met with a long applause, not angry but resolute. Across state lines, similar scenes are playing out. In Iowa, in Nebraska, in Texas. Farmers are no longer asking politely. They are pressing for legislation, for policy changes, for oversight. One proposal gaining traction would require congressional approval for broad-based tariffs, taking that power out of the hands of any single office. Polls suggest a 20-point drop in rural approval ratings for the administration. In communities where political allegiances were once carved in stone, those stones are starting to crack. This is no longer about ideology. It is about identity, about livelihood, about whether farming families have a future or just a past that no one in Washington seems to remember. The voices rising from the town halls are not radical. They are not partisan. They are the voices of people who fed the nation and now wonder if anyone is willing to feed them back. What lies ahead is more than political debate. It is a reckoning, one that could redraw not just trade lines, but the entire map of who America listens to when it talks about its future. Tough love diplomacy. What the president called tough love, many farmers began calling economic suicide. From the White House, the message was simple. Tariffs were working. They were bringing other nations to the table and making America strong again. The optics were polished, flags, speeches, sound bites. On the ground, though, every new announcement came with a cost. Farmers weren't hearing strength. They were seeing invoices. Markets were closing, buyers were disappearing, and they were left feeling like pawns in a game they couldn't win. A leaked memo from a senior White House aide warned of volatile rural support and urged a shift in tone. The suggested messaging, long-term gains, short-term resilience, felt distant to families scraping by. Meanwhile, press conferences continued. Each new round of tariffs came with new promises. Better deals, stronger leverage, a brighter future. Yet what farmers saw were repossessed machines, unsold grain, and empty pantries. Faith wasn't breaking out of betrayal. It was eroding from exhaustion. And in Washington, lawmakers were starting to feel the pressure. Capitol Hill showdown. The frustration reached Capitol Hill with force. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle began receiving a wave of letters and calls, many from the same voters who once cheered them into office. Now those voices warned of broken promises. At the heart of the debate was a new bill requiring congressional approval for sweeping tariffs. Support was growing. Its sponsors argued that trade wars were too big, too damaging, to be waged by the executive branch alone. Congressman Aaron Lee of Missouri stood before the House chamber and didn't hold back. "Our farmers are being used like poker chips," he said, "and we're all pretending this is strategy, not desperation." Agricultural lobbies that once stayed quiet began shifting. The American Soybean Association signaled support. The National Farmers Union endorsed the bill outright. Even the American Farm Bureau Federation, often slow to engage, issued a cautious statement calling for balance and stability. Behind the scenes, lobbying intensified. Exporters feared permanent damage to global contracts. Equipment makers worried about a downturn in rural demand. The pressure on lawmakers was mounting fast, and while debate churned in Washington, the rest of the world was already moving forward. Rivals on the move. While America argued, its competitors acted. Brazil stepped up soybean exports to China, locking in contracts for 5 planting seasons. Russia secured wheat deals across Asia, building a corridor that once belonged to American growers. Even Argentina began picking up pork orders once headed for U.S. markets. At the port of Santos, Brazil's largest, ships were filling fast. A logistics manager told reporters, "We don't need to advertise. Buyers come to us now." That wasn't a boast. It was a fact. In Beijing, state-run buyers announced they would phase out U.S. agricultural imports indefinitely. They cited price instability, unreliable policy, and new, more dependable partners. In Europe, American goods vanished from shelves. Turkey, South Africa, and Chile took their place. In Southeast Asia, Vietnamese rice replaced U.S. shipments. No one was waiting. These weren't temporary diversions. They were permanent redirections. Trade relationships built over generations were being rewritten in a matter of months. And back home, the cost of losing those relationships was starting to show, not just in spreadsheets, but in homes, co-ops, and communities across the country. Union Farm Alliance. A surprising coalition was taking shape, one that hadn't been seen in American politics in many generations. Farm owners and farm workers, long separated by class and culture, were joining forces. So were unionized factory workers, port operators, and truckers, all of whom felt the ripple effects of lost agricultural trade. In Wisconsin, members of the Rural Workers Unity Alliance organized a march with local dairy cooperatives. In Georgia, poultry plant workers and independent farmers co-signed a petition demanding an end to retaliatory tariffs. On social media, the hashtag #NoMoreTariffs trended alongside images of tractors and picket signs. Maria Delgado, a labor organizer in California's Central Valley, stood with a microphone in front of a crowded courthouse square. "We are the people who grow the food and the people who package it. We are not enemies, we are neighbors." The alliance was more than symbolic, it was strategic. Labor unions brought infrastructure, legal expertise, and media connections. Farmers brought visibility, land, and the moral weight of rural decline. Together they began to push for trade policy reform, not as an economic issue but as a human one. Membership in the alliance grew by 15% in a matter of weeks. Donations surged. National newspapers took notice. Commentators, once dismissive of heartland grievances, began revising their tone. What began as isolated outcry was now a movement. Not left, not right, simply fed up. The coalition's momentum carried into policy rooms and legislative hearings. It brought new urgency to negotiations, and it reminded everyone watching that rural voices, once thought passive, could become powerful when united. In the shadow of all this organizing, the question was no longer whether farmers could survive. It was whether the system that broke them could ever be rebuilt, and what role they would play in shaping what came next. After the siege, when the noise of the trade war finally faded, what remained wasn't peace, it was uncertainty. The markets had moved on, the buyers were gone, and the farmers who once fed the world were left staring at empty loading docks and full silos. Raj Patel stood at the edge of his family's land in northern Texas, staring out at dry fields and calculating whether staying was worth it. He wasn't preparing to plant, he was preparing to leave. His family had worked that land for as long as he could remember, but the numbers no longer added up. He had begun looking at warehouse jobs in Dallas, thinking about stability instead of stewardship. He is not alone. Recent surveys by the American Agricultural Future Foundation indicate nearly 1 in 3 farmers under the age of 40 is considering a new profession. The economics are clear. The markets that once supported American farms have shifted. Brazil now supplies the soybeans. Russia handles the wheat. Vietnam is picking up the slack in poultry and rice. America's dominance wasn't defeated. It was replaced. These new arrangements are not temporary. They are strategic, long-term, and locked in. Buyers are no longer waiting for America to return. They are busy writing new contracts, building new ports, and strengthening relationships with suppliers who offer one thing the U.S. no longer guarantees: consistency. What began as political maneuvering has resulted in a global agricultural realignment. And while the headlines have moved on, many in rural America are left with a quieter, more permanent kind of loss. Rewriting the rules. Across Ottawa, Tokyo, and Jakarta, new deals are being shaped. Where American voices once led, They now participate, carefully, cautiously, and often from a step behind. Trust has been fractured. Relationships that once relied on American stability now come with caveats and safeguards. In the Asia-Pacific corridor, Trade Envoy Mei Lin summarized the new reality bluntly. The door isn't closed, but we are not the only guest at the table anymore. Ongoing negotiations include phased tariff reductions, some stretching over 5 years, others over 10. Where once Washington demanded concessions, it now offers them. Former partners remember the volatility, they remember the threats, and those memories shape every draft clause and every deadline. Inside the World Trade Organization and similar bodies, legal hurdles have emerged. The automatic re-entry clauses the U.S. once counted on are being challenged. Other nations want proof that American commitments will last longer than a single administration. Still, progress is happening. Nations are not opposed to American agriculture. They are cautious. They want reliability, transparency. They want rules that survive beyond one political cycle. The rebuilding is happening, but it is slow, bureaucratic, and vulnerable to disruption. Farmers back home are watching these talks closely, knowing the outcome could determine whether their work has a market or merely a memory. Innovation from adversity. Out of the wreckage, something new has begun to grow. In the rural heartlands where barns once stood empty, lights are turning on again, not for livestock, but for hydroponic gardens, microgreens, and vertical farms. In Ohio, Leah Thompson converted a section of her family's old corn farm into a vertical greenhouse. With help from a regional innovation grant, she now supplies produce to more than 50 schools and hospitals across the state. Her pivot wasn't born from vision, it was born from necessity. "We stopped trying to out-export the world," she said. "We started trying to feed our neighbors." Venture capital is following. According to data from the Food Innovation Council, agricultural technology investment jumped 50% over just one quarter. Small-scale co-ops are launching subscription services for meat, eggs, and fresh produce. More consumers, shaken by fragile supply chains and price volatility, are turning to local sources they can trust. These changes are not universal, nor are they a full substitute for the global trade once lost. But they are seeds of something more resilient, something more human-scaled, less dependent on tariffs, treaties, or distant buyers. These new models may not make anyone rich, but they offer something many farmers had forgotten was possible: control. Harvest's final verdict. From a distance, the land looks unchanged. Green stretches over the fields. Combines roll forward in tight, practiced rows. Silos stand tall. But ask anyone who works the soil, and they will tell you the truth. This harvest is not the same. In Iowa, Tom Brenner walks between two new grain bins he built last winter. One is half full, the other is waiting. He built them with money borrowed during better times, believing new trade routes would open. Now he isn't sure what to do. "I planted the same acres," he said, "but it doesn't feel like I'm harvesting anything." The United States Department of Agriculture projects modest recovery, but not this season, and maybe not the next. Even if prices rise, buyers may not return in the numbers farmers need, and those who have left the land are unlikely to come back. What remains is a country reshaped by decisions it can no longer undo. The export dominance is gone. The global standing has shifted. The trust, in many corners, is still broken. Whether this is the beginning of a new chapter or the quiet end of a long one depends not just on global markets or trade deals, but on whether the people in charge decide the American farmer is still worth fighting for. Because the hands that feed a nation deserve more than slogans. They deserve a future. Now, was this a betrayal of America's farmers, or just global business as usual? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.